Happy Monday, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I hope that you are well amidst quite a bit of geopolitical chaos over the last week in particular. So, wherever you are in the world, I hope that this psychedelic news roundup for this Monday afternoon on March 3rd finds you well. For those unfamiliar, my name is Jack Gorsline. I'm an investigative reporter and founder of Psychedelic States of America. I am here hosting solo for the very first time ever. Last Monday, I was joined by Psychedelics Today founder Joe Moore, a good friend of PSA, and a frequent collaborator and a legend in his own right, to talk a little bit about some of the recent news across the psychedelic industry. So, in an effort to keep the momentum rolling, I am here hosting solo for about a half hour on this good Monday afternoon. I'm live from Washington, D.C., where, believe it or not, despite it supposedly being closer to spring, it is snowing outside. So we've got a lot of really interesting topics to cover today, some policy updates out of Maryland, South Dakota, potentially out of Massachusetts, as well as some sobering news from the state of New York, as well as some federal updates, some interesting comments from one RFK Jr., HHS secretary here in Washington while on Joe Rogan's podcast over the weekend, as well as the appointment of a very psychedelic-friendly new director of the National Science Foundation with ties to both crypto and the surveillance state at large. And then lastly, we'll dig into two stories you might have missed last week. A U.S. Navy civilian employee in Japan was indicted on drug trafficking charges related to possession and distribution of psilocybin and psilocin, as well as a pretty bizarre story out of Greece, actually. The ex-finance minister, who randomly enough has ties to the gaming industry here in the United States, was indicted on drug charges after admitting that he used ecstasy once. I'm not kidding, 40 years ago. So we'll dig in a little bit to the geopolitical implications there and some of the background into, Greek politics and what's going on. So first and foremost, in the great state of Maryland, just north of where I am in DC, a task force extension bill was unanimously voted to advance further through the state legislature by the Maryland Senate last week. Unanimously, obviously, is very exciting. I alluded to last week when I was live streaming with Joe that there is a bit of controversy from grassroots advocates across the state who feel particularly left out, and we're hoping, with the support of those involved in the task force, to advance some more substantive legislation. So one thing that I find particularly interesting about this task force report that was released last year is the psilocybin delivery guidelines that were outlined as a possible phase 2 or phase 3 of theoretical legalization. But I know that there's often a bit of an uproar with grassroots advocates about task force bills. They're looking to maybe decriminalize at the state level or advance a regulatory framework like we've seen pass in Oregon, Colorado, and now in its pilot form, New Jersey, as well as New Mexico last year. But task force bills, while assembling, some phenomenal experts and interdisciplinary representatives, possibly from the Maryland Department of Public Health. I know that the task force that was put together last year had some really phenomenal minds contribute and even review the report before it was released. I think it's also worth noting that the task force report was released about 6 months late. It was supposed to be released, I believe, at the end of April last year, and instead ended up being released towards the end of 2025. So the uproar over effective and efficient use of taxpayer dollars in today's modern political landscape, regardless of which state you're in, people are very concerned as to where their tax dollars are going. And one could argue, and I know that many an advocate in Maryland has argued of late, that a task force bill does little more than put the burden on taxpayers to drum up ideas that seemingly were already drummed up last year. So we'll definitely see what the task force extension bill ends up, whether it ends up advancing further. I think it's worth noting that Governor Wes Moore of Maryland actually recently filed to run for re-election There had been speculation he might be a 2028 Democratic presidential primary candidate, but it looks like he's hunkered down as the governor of Maryland, which might provide some incentive, as we've seen major cities in Maryland like Baltimore pretty sharply address crime issues. Crime has dropped substantially in the city of Baltimore over the last 5 years in particular. And I think we could see somebody like Wes Moore take a real stab at, pun not intended, some really progressive drug policy reform efforts at the state level in the near or distant future. Time will certainly tell. We alluded to this last week as well, but South Dakota has its first piece of psychedelic legislation that's been brought forward in that state, and it is a particularly Compass Pathways friendly trigger bill, as it's known colloquially. So, for those who might not know, a trigger bill, as I refer to it, is a bill that denotes one or more, to be approved in the future, or Schedule One substances that might be approved as FDA, approved medicines, to be legalized and able to prescribe by doctors in that state upon approval of that medicine, or drug by the FDA. And notably, South Dakota, this particular bill makes note of only one future FDA-approved medicine, that being crystal polymorph psilocybin, which is the synthetic psilocybin compound that Compass Pathways has patented, also known as COMP360 in the drug development world. And is likely to be approved by the FDA either by the end of this year or the beginning of Q1 2027. So definitely would recommend listening to a recent interview hosted by Jake Slomowitz, who runs Psychedelic Vantage and hosts the Psychedelic Vantage podcast. Recently highlighted this in Psychedelic States of America's newsletter over the weekend. But Jake sat down with some of the minds behind Atai Life Sciences, which is a major stakeholder in Compass Pathways. And I think, as somebody who is not as familiar with the drug development arm of this movement, I will defer to Jake and other experts. Can't recommend Psychedelic Alpha and Josh Hardman enough, as well as a go-to source on this front. But I am very curious to see what happens at the state level as far as Compass Pathways related bills moving their way through the legislature with that very specific crystal polymorph psilocybin compound language included. I know that a similar bill was shot down in Virginia last year that's since been refiled as the Breakthrough Therapies Act, which I believe was drafted with some input and consideration and collaboration with Reason for Hope, which has been a big backer of those kinds of bills, breakthrough therapies, future FDA-approved medicines, kind of getting ahead of the curve and trying to file legislation with the future in mind, which certainly has its merits on paper, but I know that there are many an advocacy organization in states like Virginia, as well as in states, like Maryland, again, that are looking to advance more substantive legislation in the near future. And another thread, speaking of East Coast states with a penchant for psychedelic policy progress, Massachusetts had a couple of really major public events last week. In particular, at the Museum of Science, there was a history of iboga panel and presentation, sponsored in part by the folks at Americans for Ibogaine, and featuring Brian Hubbard, CEO of Americans for Ibogaine, as well as Jonathan Dickinson, who I believe works over at MBO Life Sciences, and a number of other impressive industry thought leaders, if you will. And within just 48 hours, notably, a Massachusetts for Ibogaine Instagram account had cropped up. Now, I've done some pretty extensive coverage of psychedelic policy in Massachusetts and across New England in particular. It's where I got my start covering psychedelic politics in Massachusetts in particular about 2 years ago. There's been a bevy of bills filed in the Commonwealth last year, and two in particular appear more poised to advance than others. Both are pilot program focused bills. One includes some research money for a study on decriminalization across the state, and is in particular psilocybin specific, and the other just uses the blanket term psychedelics. And so having spoken to advocates involved in getting those bills filed and involved in the legislative, shuffling and advocacy work that always goes on behind closed doors, it does seem that that latter psychedelics-focused pilot program bill filed by pretty well-respected state senator Cindy Friedman, who's the chair of a number of committees that have actually seen this bill and voted it, forward and through the Massachusetts state legislature over the latter course of last year, actually. So that bill in particular seems to have some juice behind it, and the flexibility with its legalese and the drafting to scurry up some favor with the ibogaine lobby at large. So definitely worth keeping an eye on, especially as the public events slate surrounding ibogaine in particular becomes much more populated over the next few months in particular. There's a couple of really cool conferences before I get to what's been going on at the federal level that I'd like to highlight. Psychedelic States of America, actually, we announced this a couple of weeks ago. We're proud to be a media partner for the upcoming Psychedelic Culture Conference in San Francisco, put on by the impeccable and incomparable Chacruna Institute. Really an incredible conference last year, 3 phenomenal tracks. I don't know how they do it. It's really a who's who of thought leaders across a number of disciplines. I'm really looking forward to attending this year, and it happens to fall on Bicycle Day weekend. So I am sure that it will be a phenomenal weekend of after parties. And I can't say too much just yet before we finalize all of the details, but stay tuned for a very cool Psychedelic States of America promoted event in particular if you're attending the conference on Friday, April 17th. More info to come soon. There's also a really fantastic psychedelics and religion-focused conference hosted by the Center for World Religions at Harvard in conjunction with the Petrie Flom Center, I believe. I was living in Boston last year, so I was able to attend. I won't be able to make it this year, but if you're in New England and you're able to make it, it is a 2-day bonanza of some of the most thought-provoking leaders in the intersection of psychedelics and religion today, as well as some of the most prominent critics of the New Age psychedelic religious movement. And I think in particular, that is one that was on my wish list. I'm not gonna be able to make it, but I'm curious to see how it plays out. Yeah, and so I guess to dig into what's been going on at the federal level, I talked a little bit about this week. We put out a clip from last week's show. Jim O'Neill was previously named Deputy HHS Secretary under both the W. Bush administration back in the early 2000s, but again, under Trump's second administration. He was then moved to acting director of the CDC until being let go about a week and a half ago. It just broke last week that Trump has now tapped him to be the new director of the National Science Foundation. I would really highly recommend checking out More Perfect Union's coverage of Jim O'Neill's background. I previously reported with Double Blind Magazine last year that Jim O'Neill is the former president of the Thiel Foundation, Peter Thiel being, a billionaire tech investor, co-founder of Palantir, a controversial, to say the least, tech and surveillance company. I think that's just one way to describe them. But notably, Peter Thiel has also invested a large sum of money into psychedelics research, I believe being a shareholder in a number of psychedelic biotech companies. And Jim O'Neill, as I reported with Double Blind Magazine last year, has been hinted for a good while as the most pro-psychedelic member of the administration. Has a lot of interest in longevity science as well, which we know is near and dear to the Maha movement's heart, which has kind of been lionized by RFK Jr.'s presence. What I continue to wonder about, and I'm curious to hear if any audience members have any thoughts, feel free to chime in, but also curious to continue to cover what the scientific research brain drain here in the United States will do to advancing any kind of next-gen scientific research. I mean, I could count on 2 hands and then some the number of brilliant researchers here in the States that have either lost work, lost grant funding through a number of the cuts that were enacted under the Trump administration shortly after this administration took office last year. So obviously, there's phenomenal research being conducted abroad. I had a really fascinating interview with Zeus Thibodeau, who works over at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and asked him point blank a couple of weeks ago, you know, what would you say to researchers trying to get into researching psychedelic science, especially in the current science funding climate that we have in the States? And he said, get out, leave, go abroad. So the influence of private capital and the rise of the psychedelic biotech private public partnership that we've seen pioneered through the Texas iBegan initiative will likely be the way that we make up for some of the brain drain that we'll see in terms of public funding for scientific research across any number of universities in the States. But I do continue to wonder if that will be enough. Certainly, there's no shortage of money to go around in the psychedelic biotech sector, especially when it comes to R&D. But we did see something of a market retraction last year and the year before, especially in the wake of the FDA's rejection of Lykos Therapeutics, now Resilience, MDMA, assisted therapy novel drug application. But the way that these modalities and the varying research pathways to increase access will likely be funded is largely through private capital, possibly with some matching public funding, but we're probably looking at private companies footing the bill, in part, again, due to the substantial cuts to research from the federal government of the Trump administration over the last year and a half. So speaking of RFK Jr., as was reported by Marijuana Moment and Kyle Yeager, who I can't recommend enough reading if you're looking to read anything about the latest psychedelic policy developments, Marijuana Moment should be the number one place that you're looking to for breaking news. Kyle Yeager documented that RFK Jr.'s appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast last week featured, I think, a little under 10 minutes of conversation about psychedelics in general. It's worth noting that he had said on the Joe Rogan podcast last year, and this was backed up by statements from VA Secretary Doug Collins, as well as a number of other Trump administration officials, that the Trump administration was looking to fast track psychedelic access for veterans within a year. We're now about 8 to 9 months, going on 8 to 9 months removed from those comments, and there's certainly been a lot of uproar from veterans over the last 4 months in particular as to what the holdup might be. I took a look at some of the comments that RFK Jr. made. My takeaway is the much more conservative tone surrounding access, especially for someone who's been bragging in podcast interviews in recent weeks about having done cocaine off toilet seats in his youth, and is currently in recovery from a lifelong recovery from a prior addiction to heroin. So the rhetoric that the Trump administration has enacted, especially RFK Jr. in regards to drug policy, has been at odds with, I think, what many of the drug libertarians that have been particularly hopeful as far as what reform might look like had hoped for. I'm not sure where we go from here, other than to keep an eye on where some of the bills that have been filed in Congress might go. I've previously noted that the Freedom to Heal Act is effectively dead in Congress after revealing that the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee is no longer in support of the bill moving forward. I think that there's definitely room for advancement of Catherine Tucker and Shane Pennington's petition for Dr. Sunil Agarwal's efforts to reschedule psilocybin from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. Lord knows this administration needs some distractions. We've gone to war in Iran effectively to distract from many of the other scandals that they're facing. And I wouldn't be surprised personally if advancing a Schedule 2 rescheduling effort, or at least placing some light pressure on the affiliated organizations in charge of those decisions, might be had in the not so distant future. I don't have any solid sources on that. That is pure speculation on my part. But I certainly didn't think that some of the sweeping moves to distract the American public from scandal that this administration has seemed to enact over the last 6 months in particular would be moves that they made in response to the scandals that they've generated. So I think anything goes. And that is both terrifying and maybe a little bit hopeful in some ways, especially if it means enacting psychedelic policy reform at the federal level. What else? I did not get a chance to watch Casey Means, who is, I believe, either officially U.S. Surgeon General or U.S. Surgeon General to be, her confirmation hearing. I caught some of the clips, of course, and I have done a little bit of reading into her very well-selling debut book about her perspective on wellness, um, and her medical background, and it seems certainly worth scrutiny. And I also think, in line with, as I mentioned just a bit ago, RFK Jr.'s far more conservative comments on what psychedelic access under this administration or any future administration might look like, comparative to the way that he's spoken about it before. Casey Means, who has touted, taking magic mushrooms as one of the most important decisions of her life, when pressed by, I believe it was Senator Susan Collins of Maine, about her use of magic mushrooms and the potential public health dangers that their use might pose. Um, Means took a much more conservative rhetoric, again, saying that she wouldn't recommend that everyone used psychedelics or psilocybin, and that she would definitely like to see more research. Um, and then lastly, when it comes to federal policy, something that caught my eye, there were two really fantastic psychedelic conferences down in New Orleans last weekend, both the Psychedelic Drug and Development Conference, which has previously been hosted in Boston and I believe in San Diego, as well as the International Summit on Psychedelic Research. Apologies if I'm butchering that name. Two that I really wished I could have made it to, but one quote from the conference fray that stood out is, I saw somewhere that a director of NIDA specifically noted that drugs that carry acute cardiac risks will likely have a difficult time being approved by the FDA. Now, anyone who knows anything about ibogaine knows that there are some acute cardiac risks with ibogaine use. Now, there's obviously a massive, well, maybe not obviously, if you aren't aware, Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals, one of the leading psychedelic biotech companies today, sold their basically entire analog ibogaine suite of research, as well as one of their most prominent patented formulas, to international pharmaceutical giant AbbVie Pharmaceutical last year, I believe, for a cool $1.2 billion, as well as some other stock, cash incentives, all of the things. Pretty lucrative deal. It was by far the largest acquisition in psychedelic science and psychedelic biotech last year by one larger company to another. But it also signaled that multinational big pharma is taking psychedelics with real hallucinogenic effects, not just the neuroplastogens, the non-trip psychedelics, but they're taking real hardcore, psychedelic science seriously with this acquisition. And it also placed a lot of confidence in the likelihood that this particular ibogaine-inspired analog compound developed by Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals that AbbVie Pharmaceutical now owns will have a clear pathway to FDA approval in the future. And I don't doubt that that's true, but I do wonder what other ibogaine-inspired compounds, what pathway they may have. I wonder what this means for ibogaine's rescheduling potential. I think very notably, and this rings in my mind anytime I think about future ibogaine policy reform, is that last year, when former Texas Governor Rick Perry joined Brian Hubbard on Joe Rogan's podcast, there was a bit of commentary about his hope to see ibogaine rescheduled, right? To put it in layman's terms, Schedule 1, by the DEA's own definition, means that there is no medical benefit to use of said drug. I think it's pretty clear, given the FDA, breakthrough therapy designations that have been handed down to a number of Schedule 1 derived drugs that are in development, such as Compass Pathways, COMP360, that there is inherent medical benefit to a number of these psychedelic compounds, and yet they remain at Schedule 1, awaiting FDA approval from one of their pharmaceutical counterpoints. If that road becomes more complicated for ibogaine as a general substance, or iboga as a general substance, right? I do wonder, and again, wild speculation on my part, but I think these are threads worth following. I do really wonder where the future of ibogaine scheduling, or potential challenge to its current Schedule 1 status may lie. Um, there's certainly plenty of research backing up the viability of ibogaine to treat a number of complex conditions that there are no known or no high quality treatments for, at least not nearly with the efficacy that ibogaine treatment can provide. So, definitely worth keeping an eye on, given, again, the director of NIDA said, either at a conference in New Orleans over the weekend or previously, as quoted while they were in New Orleans, that drugs with acute cardiac risks will likely have a difficult road being approved by the FDA as medicine. Um, so, coming up on the end, man, 27 minutes really flies by when you're having fun. I do want to highlight two really crazy stories that broke just before the weekend that you might not read about elsewhere. So, in Japan, there's been a lot of talk recently in the psychedelic community because of the arrest of famous actor from Emily in Paris on Netflix, as well as of Broadway star and acclaim Jeremy Harris, who was arrested for possession of 0.74 grams of MDMA upon entering Japan by way of London, and was incarcerated for 2 weeks, awaiting whether or not he would be charged. Now, it does appear that Jeremy Harris was not charged, and has since gone on to be interviewed by Oprah about the entire ordeal. But it has had me wondering, in particular, what other activity in Japan there might be surrounding American citizens and psychedelic use. And as I said, just before the weekend, actually broken by Stars and Stripes. I'm going to share my screen here. A U.S. Navy civilian, I believe he was working as let's see, I believe he was working in aircraft repair, from my understanding, but was indicted last Tuesday on charges of smuggling psychedelic drugs into Japan by mail. Looks like a psilocybin and psilocin compound, about 131 grams. For reference, that's, man, pushing 4 or 5 ounces of what would be, probably, again, it looks like capsules. Japan really doesn't play around with this stuff. They really do not. I was fortunate enough to talk to an incredibly acclaimed reporter, Jake Adelstein, author of Tokyo Vice, who has been covering kind of the seedy underbelly of the Japanese world of crime over the last 20 years. And I was able to speak with him in my coverage of the Jeremy Harris case in particular. And he was kind enough to write a really phenomenal guest column for Psychedelic States of America, taking a closer look at the Harris case, but also really outlining the unforgiving hammer that is the Japanese criminal justice system when it comes to drug use. There had been indications in Japan, and I think there was some really phenomenal coverage from Vice a number of years ago. And I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes once we put this back up on YouTube and across other platforms. But Japan, up until a few years ago, had some pretty lax. They essentially didn't have an equivalent of what here in the States we have, the Federal Analogs Act, that basically automatically categorizes obscure LSD analogs you might be able to splice off in a kitchen or in a chemist lab as Schedule 1 substances because of their similarity, of their chemistry to that of LSD proper, if you will. So Japan didn't really have any version of that until a few years ago. I believe about 5-10 years ago. So in 2018 or 2019, you could buy LSD analogs on Amazon Marketplace, and get them delivered to your door in downtown Tokyo. There has since been a pretty significant tightening up of drug laws that had looked like Japan was moving in the direction of loosening their enforcement of cannabis laws, and I think even had. And there has since been a pretty notable shift to the right of the political spectrum. Japan's current prime minister is one of the more hardline right-wing politicians to be in charge, and I believe the better part of a half century. And rising sentiments surrounding tourists and expatriate communities have started to flare up with certain xenophobic undertones and overtones. So it is particularly curious to see two pretty harsh prosecutions, albeit Jeremy Harris, being a celebrity, seems to have been able to kind of wriggle his way out of prosecution in his case and made it back to the States safely. But we're seeing a pretty ruthless prosecution of this U.S. Navy civilian employee here in Japan. So the other story that I don't know enough about to speak of at length, so it's good to close on, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Um, a member of the Greek Parliament, who was previously actually the finance minister of Greece, which, for those unfamiliar with European geopolitics, Greece's financial situation has certainly fluctuated over the better part of the last 20 years. Pretty significant debt crisis cropping up not once but twice in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And so this is somebody who came in and seemingly righted the ship and has stuck around and is a member of parliament now, who seemingly in a pretty clear act of political retribution due to his current political leanings versus that of the ruling party, was indicted last week on drug charges after admitting, I believe in an interview a couple of months ago, that he had used ecstasy once, about 40 years ago in London. One time, public use. So it's a pretty fascinating abuse of power, drawing on, again, psychedelic use from nearly a half century ago from this one individual. I first found out about this story actually from, I believe, PC Insider. This particular individual was previously, I'm going to find his name so that I give him proper representation. Yanis Varoufakis, I'm going to say, who called the prosecution after admitting taking ecstasy 40 years ago ridiculous. He is notably left-wing in a political climate in Greece that is having its own right-leaning renaissance, if you will, and I believe has been a pretty outspoken supporter of providing refuge to war refugees from across the region. Is also, from my understanding, from the Middle East in particular, which, noble as it is, has welcomed some significant political backlash against him. So the weaponization of psychedelic use to politically prosecute one's enemies is fascinating, but not necessarily unsurprising. We're seeing a number of, repetitively, of course, redundantly, of course, but unprecedented seems to be the word of the century at this point. And I think we're only going to see more and more unprecedented political intertwinings between psychedelic use, psychedelic progress, and possibly psychedelic backlash. I cannot believe it has been a half hour already. We're going on 33 minutes strong. We've got 56 people tuning in live. I so appreciate you taking a half hour of your time with me on this Monday afternoon. I'm going to get out of here for now. I do just want to close by saying that this grows if you are kind enough to share what we're working on. So I've got a number of really exciting projects that I'm working on with the team at Psychedelics Today, with some of our friends over at Double Blind Magazine, a number of others. This only really works, this independent psychedelic journalism game, if we have your direct support. So as you can see at the bottom, really would encourage you to subscribe and donate to Psychedelic States of America. We're a nonprofit sponsored independent news organization, psychedelicamericas.org. If every person tuning in live today donated 10 or 20 bucks, you'd help us cover our digital infrastructure cost for at least 3 to 6 months, depending on your generosity. So really cannot thank you enough for tuning in. But the next step, as we continue to build out some really exciting collaborative partnerships across the psychedelic media ecosystem, is to have a direct stake in supporting whatever comes next. With that, I will let you all go, 59 strong and counting. My name is Jack Gorsline. This has been the Psychedelic States of America Monday News Hour, and we will see you later this week.